Este episodio es presentado por Honda. Descubra la nueva Honda Passport Trail Sport todoterreno. La Passport más todoterreno que Honda haya imaginado jamás. Esta Passport cuenta con mayor altura al suelo, barras de techo en todas sus versiones y neumáticas especialmente diseñados para cualquier terreno. Además, disfruta todos tus viajes con el control de clima de 3 zonas, techo panorámico y opciones como asientos delanteros con calefacción y ventilación. Conoce más en honda.com/Passport.
Today on CityCast Madison. The spring election is near. Early voting starts on March 18th, and we want you to be prepared. So we're bringing you a statewide voter guide for what to expect on the ballot, from the proposed constitutional amendment to the state school superintendent race to the highly anticipated state Supreme Court race. We invited on intrepid Cap-Time state government reporter Andrew Bahl to bring us up to speed. It's Monday, March 10th. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Hi, Andrew. Welcome back.
Hey, Bianca. Being back on the show must mean it's election time or something.
Yeah, I think it is. It's time for the spring election. We're in this season. And being that we're here, I know there are kind of things for voters to keep in mind before going to the ballot box, deadlines, general basics. What should folks be keeping in mind before casting their ballots?
Yeah, well, first off, there is an election, and that may be shocking to everyone because it felt like, well, didn't we just do this whole election thing last year? And we did, but we had so much fun, we're going to do it again. Maybe, maybe not. But yeah, I mean, that really is the first big thing is like, make sure your friends and neighbors know there is something to go vote for on April 1st, no matter where you are in the state of Wisconsin, and particularly here in Dane County. The first big thing, maybe if you weren't around here for the 2024 election, is to get registered to vote. You have until March 12th to go online and do that. You also can go do that at your local clerk's office, the Madison clerk's office, or wherever you are in Dane County until March 28th. Or you can go to the polls and do it on election day. Just make sure you have proof of address, like a utility bill, housing list from UW-Madison, and also make sure that you have your photo ID. And we'll get to that in a second, but that is required to vote. Driver's license, passport, tribal ID, college ID, depending on where you go to college, things like that. And if you don't have a photo ID, you can get one for free from the DMV, and you should go online either to the DMV website or to the Cap Times voter guide, and it'll tell you what you need to do that.
Yes. Hit it. Go find out what you need. And yeah, now that y'all have that information, the generals, get registered, be prepared. Now we're going to help you with what's on our ballot. Specifically today, we're talking about the statewide ballot. I do quickly want to mention that we here on CityCast Madison will be hitting local races too. We've got a city council episode tomorrow, both an interview with outgoing council member Juliana Bennett, and you'll also hear some responses to our city council election survey that we sent out to candidates to get their priorities for Madison. Definitely come back for that. We're also pursuing a conversation with candidates in the contested Madison school board seat, so definitely stay close for those upcoming episodes. But here, let's kick it off. Let's talk about the statewide ballot measures and candidates. As you alluded to, photo ID. Andrew, let's start at the bottom of the ballot this time with the proposed state constitutional amendment. What are the powers that be trying to change in our Constitution?
Yeah, so in Wisconsin, we've had a law requiring folks to present their photo ID to vote, as I just alluded to, since the 2016 election. And this has been something that has divided people over the years. It was challenged in court pretty extensively back a decade or so ago when it was passed. The argument being that requiring someone present their photo ID to vote makes the election more secure. That's what supporters say. Critics say that it just is kind of a way to make it harder for certain groups of people to vote. UW-Madison students have to get an extra photo ID in addition to their WIS card in order to vote. People who don't have reliable transportation to go to the DMV may find it harder to get that driver's license. If they're older, they might not drive. So that can be a challenge for folks. The reason why this is on the ballot as a constitutional amendment is that there are some concerns that Republicans have said that maybe this law will get challenged in court. We'll talk about the Wisconsin Supreme Court in a little bit, but there's now a liberal majority on that court. They say maybe it'll get struck down, and we want to put this in the state constitution to prevent that from happening.
They want to solidify it.
Yes.
They don't want anyone to come and overturn the work that they've done to make this a requirement.
Exactly. And it's kind of a weird one because usually we talk about these things as like what happens if it doesn't pass or what happens if it does. And in this case, not a ton changes. People will still be going to the polls and voting in the same way that they have been. But it really kind of comes down to how badly the state wants photo ID requirements to be the status quo going forward. If it's in the state constitution, it's much harder to change, much harder to repeal. And it would really mean that Wisconsin will have this policy on the books going forward for the foreseeable future.
And so a yes vote would be, yes, let's change the Constitution to require photo ID.
Exactly. Yeah.
And a no vote is no, thank you. It's already in the law. And we don't want it to be solidified.
That's always important because the language is always a little tricky with these. So.
Yeah. In terms of groups that are, pushing for people to vote no, do you know anything about that? Like who's against this measure? Obviously, you're talking about it might have a disproportionate impact on certain populations over others.
Yeah. So it has been a lot of voting rights groups urging that no vote, kind of like a concern about access and keeping a barrier in place that will prevent people from voting. At the same time, this has been something that I think conservative groups are trying to use to get their voters to come out and cast a ballot, also for things like state Supreme Court and state superintendent of public instruction. And so it will be interesting to see to what degree this will impact some of those other races.
Yeah. So every time we talk about the constitutional amendments, I'm always wondering, is this going to be obtuse language? There is only one. So I think this one is a little bit more straightforward, but there is a little bit of the lack of clarity towards the end, sort of subject to exceptions, which may be established by the law. There's always a hope that they make these a little bit more plain spoken for the average person out here. Are you an entrepreneur looking for the support, resources, and network to take your business to the next level? Or maybe you're interested in becoming an investor, ready to make a real impact. At Doyen, they're breaking barriers and changing the game for entrepreneurs of startup ventures. Through their triple threat venture training, investor accelerator, coaching services, and learning lab, they provide the tools, mentorship, and funding to help businesses grow and succeed. Their mission? To create a more inclusive, equitable entrepreneurial ecosystem where diverse founders thrive. Join them at their next event, connect with their community, or support their work by becoming a mentor, partner, or donor. Visit doyengroup.org to learn more. It's time to build something amazing together.
Support comes from ServiceNow. We're for people doing the creative work they actually want to do. That's why this ad was written and read by a real person and not AI. You know what people don't want to do? Boring, busy work. Now with AI agents built into the ServiceNow platform, you can automate millions of repetitive tasks in every corner of your business, IT, HR, and more, so your people can focus on the work that they want to do. That's putting AI agents to work for people. It's your turn. Visit servicenow.com.
Let's turn to the competitive state races, starting with the race for state schools superintendent. There was a primary last month with the current superintendent, Jill Underly, and education consultant, Brittany Kinzer, advancing. What do we know about these two candidates?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting race. And first off, I think maybe it's important for people to understand a little bit more about what the state superintendent of public instruction does, because Wisconsin's actually kind of unusual in that we elect this position. And we're even more unusual that we give them a fair amount of power to decide really a lot of important policy decisions about public education in the state. And so we have Jill Underly, the incumbent. This is her first term in office. She took over on a full-time basis after Governor Evers was elected There's an interim, but she was kind of the first one to hold this full time. She has had generally some support from the education community, but also there have been some things that have been a little more divisive. She made a move to change kind of what the state standards look like. That has got a lot of pushback from Republicans, but also people who are concerned that it represents kind of a rolling back of state standards.
And that was a recent thing that happened, right?
Yeah, that is. And we've seen even more recently a response in the legislature to try and kind of counteract that, conveniently timed with the state superintendent election. I will also say that trying to keep this in the news while people go to the polls, that's made this race a little more interesting, a little more hot button than maybe it has been in the past. And the state superintendent is running against Brittany Kinzer, who is an education consultant and has, I think, tried to frame herself a little bit differently on some of the issues and present herself as kind of someone who's going to come in and reform the State Department of Public Instruction and get away from kind of business as usual, and has also in the process earned backing from conservatives who see her as having a real chance to be a viable candidate to win, something that Republicans really have not had in a number of years for this statewide position.
I know some people were surprised that she won over someone who's very similar to Underly. It is really interesting to hear that she would be coming in on reform when we just discussed that Underly made a change to state standards on state tests, and it was not received very well. So in terms of what the appetite for change is in that position, it seems a little bit at the crosshairs, I guess, with what we just saw happen with the current superintendent. I will say I also saw that about Brittany Kinzer, that there's been some questions about her qualifications, I guess, in Wisconsin.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. I believe it was something to the effect of she doesn't have an active teaching license, and that would disqualify her from holding certain posts in a school building. That is not a requirement for being state superintendent, which is also interesting in of itself. But she's tried to frame herself as someone who still has that experience and has worked in kind of a variety of different roles, has a bit of a different perspective, and also has a bit of a different perspective on things like school choice, which is a bit unusual. Superintendent Underly has been critical of the school choice program, has said, we want to put more money into public schools. Brittany Kinzer, I think, has come at it from the perspective of these are viable options for students. We should lean into that. And maybe look at whether we should put more money into the Wisconsin's 3 voucher programs. So that's a little bit of a unique wrinkle as well.
Yeah, that was definitely seems like the key difference between those two for sure. So that tension between public and private here, it rears its head again. I want to turn to Wisconsin's most watched race, our state Supreme Court election. If anyone watches local TV, you've certainly seen some ads about it. That race is projected to yet again break records as the most expensive race of its kind in U.S. history. So let's get into this high-profile race. The candidates are Dane County Circuit Court Judge Susan Crawford, who's liberal-leaning, and Waukesha Circuit Court Judge Brad Schimmel, who's conservative-leaning. They'll replace outgoing liberal Justice Ann Walsh Bradley, who's been in the court for almost 3 decades. So this is a big moment. Can you talk about these two candidates, like who they are and what issues they're really campaigning the most on?
Yeah, so this is a really important race, as you alluded to. And maybe first, I'll just mention the stakes, because I think that kind of lays the groundwork for who these candidates are and what they're talking about. This election will determine whether liberal justices or conservative justices control the court and have a majority. And that has really big impacts. We've seen the left-leaning majority have really big rulings on legislative maps and ushering in new legislative maps. That has changed how the legislature looks a little bit. Rulings on voting rights and allowing the use of ballot drop boxes again. And they'll be issuing in the future major rulings on abortion rights. So this is really consequential and will really shape what Wisconsin looks like, not just in the matter of jurisprudence, but in all of these different areas that impact people's lives. Brad Schimmel, who used to be Attorney General, folks maybe have heard his name for that reason, has really been running as pushing back on how the left-leaning majority has been behaving, saying that they are departing from tradition, departing from common sense is how he, I think, has framed a lot of this. That obviously is very much up for debate, but he says he wants to return the court to where it really was for much of the 2010s, which was conservative control, and looking much different than we've seen the last 2 years. At the same time, Susan Crawford, circuit court judge from here in Dane County, has, I think, framed herself also as a common sense judicial voice, but is trying to project her values as being in alignment with the liberal majority on things like abortion. And a vote in this election is very much going to come down to if you like the idea of a left-leaning majority, regardless of whether you are intimately familiar with Susan Crawford and her background. That's probably where you're going to go. And same if you would like to move away from that, you're probably going to vote for Brad Schimmel, regardless of how much you know about him. And these judicial races are really tough because there aren't always platforms that these candidates have because they're limited in what they can say as judges.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that this race will drive higher voter turnout for this election, just considering all the court cases you just mentioned, these big ticket items that people really care about?
All signs point to very high enthusiasm and engagement on both sides. I think that control of the court matters a lot to people, but also just the general political environment will, I think, motivate people on both sides. We saw obviously very high engagement with backers of President Trump in November. The key, I think, for conservatives is to keep that going in races like this, which are lower turnout races, not as sexy as the presidential races. And on the flip side, for liberals, they might be really concerned and frustrated by what's going on in Washington. And the state Democratic Party chair, Ben Wickler, has really been going out and saying to people, if you're looking for a way to fight back, this is the way to do that. And as far as spring elections go, this will be a very high turnout one.
Our primary was a little sleepy there. It's a little bit lower turnout, but I guess that's to be imagined. We know that as I mentioned, the TAC ads are alive and well. I've already seen, probably 30 of them. And that's from on both sides. Money is really pouring in. I do imagine this race is expected to be pretty competitive. Do you think either of them have a competitive edge over the other? What are you hearing?
I think it's going to be very close. And a lot of it really comes down to, we were just talking about enthusiasm. A lot of it comes down to turnout and, what side is going to turn out their core supporters more. And that's why you see so much money to try and help people become aware of this race and aware of the stakes. The 2023 race, which gave left-leaning justices control of the court, is the most expensive race in judicial history in the entire United States. It was about $52 million, I believe, in the end. This race is actually on pace to top that. And I think it would almost be a surprise at this point if it didn't. We're seeing Elon Musk, whose name has been in the news a fair amount. He's spending money in support of Brad Schimmel. You're seeing plenty of money flow in through the state Democratic Party on the other side as well. And that's why, all of us can't turn on the TV or turn on YouTube without seeing 5 ads on this race, making everyone wish it wasn't election season still.
Is it true that this is just the first state Supreme Court race in a series of 6 years to come? Did I read that correctly? Is that a thing?
Yeah, at least in it will be next year and then the year after for sure. And that's another reason why this race is so key is if conservatives don't win this, they're going to be stuck with a liberal majority in this court for at least the next 2 or 3 years because the next 2 Supreme Court elections actually are conservative justices who will be on the ballot. So they're really going to be fighting to maintain the status quo and maintain what voice they do have on the bench if they don't win this one. Conversely, for left-leaning justices, you'll have another crack at the majority in a year. I don't think that lessens the stakes in their mind, but it will not be the last time we're hearing about the state Supreme Court. I think that's pretty safe to say.
Yeah. Well, we do have asks out to both candidates. If you are listening or your team is listening right now, please do come on our show. You got a lot of voters listening, and we'll treat you well and fair, I promise. Andrew, before we let you go, what else is on your mind, and what are you paying attention to as we move closer to the election?
I think the biggest thing, and this will bring it full circle, is just underscoring for people how important these races are. We talked a lot last year about trying to get people excited about races that maybe are flying under the radar a little bit more, and that definitely holds true here because people understandably should be paying attention to what's going on in Washington and familiarizing themselves with all the changes we're seeing at the federal level and the federal government. But these races really impact how people live their lives here in Wisconsin. The city council races that you're going to be talking to folks about really impact how people live their lives here in Madison. So just cannot say it enough. Make sure that you're registered to vote. Do the same with your friends and family, and maybe read the Cap Times too while you're at it.
Yes. Read the Cap Times, go vote, come back and listen to our city council conversation, do all of the things. Andrew, you are the best. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show and give us the goods about the spring election. We really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thanks for having me.
That's Andrew Bahl, Cap Times state government reporter. Cap Times will be dropping their own voter guide early this week. If you want to read more, we'll link to their elections page in our show notes. And hey, if you want to know what's specifically on your ballot, we'll also drop a link to My Vote Wisconsin in our show notes. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, your host. If you enjoyed the show, why don't you share this episode with someone who votes? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take good care and prepare to vote.